Kate Milifalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen, and it's time for our Saturday book. Last couple of weeks have been very heavy topics, and so I looked for something lighter. You can't get much lighter than ghosts. So this week we're doing Phone Calls from the Dead, the result of a 2-year investigation into incredible phenomenon by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless, with the postscript by Callum E. Cooper. Now, the two men who did this study and collated all this information was done in 1979, 1980. They've subsequently died, and the book itself was put together when they finished the study, and the postscript by Callum Cooper was added to this edition in 1925. Unbeknownst to me, I found out, I'm shuffling things around here, I found out that Professor Cooper, hang on, wrote this book, Telephone Calls from the Dead. Now, I haven't read it. I have read this one, but I didn't receive this one until I was all done with the first one. But the mystery will be cleared up, because all things being equal, Professor Cooper is going to come and have a little chat here about his work with the authors of the book and with this book as well, so he can fill us in. I'm really looking forward to it. He is all the way over in England. He is at the University of Northampton, so we're honored. This is very exciting. In the meantime, let's talk about this book, because this book is full of really interesting stories. I think we all need a little distraction, so I think this will be really, really fun. So, Phone Calls from the Dead by Rogo and Bayless. It would help if I could read my own handwriting. We would get through things a whole lot faster. Okay, there's a preface. It says it's from the personal investigation and done over a couple of years period of time, and a lot of pseudonyms. People wanted to remain anonymous. They thought they might get raised eyebrows if people knew who they were. I personally think it's just really interesting. So, kudos for them to being willing to even talk. So the introduction begins. Death is always of interest. The introduction mentions movements in 1979, pertinent to the time the book came out, that reflect at the time a growing desire to find meaning in life. The somewhat older hippies were starting to really dig into these things. New Age was a thing, right? In 1979, more people began to view death not as a termination, but part of a greater, unique experience. And this book refers to other books in the 70s that suggested potential survival after death. Now, I have covered those books a long time ago. It may be time to revisit them. I don't know. Tell me what you think. Let me know in the comments. Raymond Moody. I can't even remember the names of them. It's been so long since I've read them, but I've got them here somewhere and I could dig them out if you're interested. Talking about memories of past life experiences, memories of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, visitations, etc. I did that book by Whitley Strieber, who wrote it ostensibly with the co-authorship of his wife, who had already died, through meditation. I thought that was really interesting. So parapsychologists, now keep in mind, this book was originally written a really long time ago. I'm getting old. It doesn't seem that long to me. But 1979, 1980 was, 46 years ago? Good Lord. Um, Things have changed. I think minds are more open. That's not in this book. I'm just saying that. But he said that parapsychologists have been interested in investigating uh, contact from the dead forever. It's not new to them, but parapsychology was always kind of a fringe thing. At the time the book was written, it was one of the very first to say that we do survive death and we can contact uh, our loved ones who are living after we die. It's not a new idea, though. Absolutely not. But the new part, the novelty at the time, and it's so funny how technology has changed. And I do know that this second book, I looked at the contents, I just got it today. The second book does contain mention of things like emails and cell phones. So I'm excited to get an update on that. In the meantime, the new element in 1979 was that people were not getting messages from table tapping, they were getting phone calls. In 1967, for example, he tells the story of women who got a phone call from one son who was dead, had been dead for 2 years in a motorcycle accident. So I wrote women and I meant singular woman, unless he had 2 mothers, I don't know. But a woman got the message that her son called her 2 years after he died in a motorcycle accident. And she told the authors, because they were looking for people to tell stories. And he thought, that was a prank, right? The authors were not sure what to believe. But by the time this book was written, that was in 67. So by 79, when this book was written, there was a real growing willingness to listen to these stories and accept them, perhaps not immediately on face value, but they weren't dismissed immediately either. In 74, the authors recognized that some psychic phenomena, they were not being studied. And it was intentional that they were being ignored, especially phenomena that were kind of more spiritual. So some UFO apparitions, some religious apparitions, Bigfoot, they were still really looked at with raised eyebrows in 1974. Now, there's all these TV shows about Bigfoot. The authors extended their studies into neglected psychic topics. They heard from so many people about the phone calls that they had received from their dead loved ones and acquaintances. This was a little surprising to the authors. Could the phone be used as a channel of contact from the dead to the living? That was a novel idea. So they studied it for 2 years and they concluded it did happen. It's a real phenomenon. Now, what's the explanation? That's the rub, right? They knew it's not a hoax. There were too many provable facts around some of these stories that really indicated not hoaxes. The receiver was often shocked, and these things have just been swept under the rug, ignored. So this book is about the 2-year investigation. They now, at the time of the writing, they thought that perhaps they can predict maybe when these things are likely to happen. There seems to be an energetic, perfect moment for them to happen. And maybe even figure out how they're produced, like the mechanics of it. It's the strangest thing that they said they had ever encountered in parapsychology. So that was called the introduction, but it was actually the first chapter. And now we're on chapter 2, In Search of a Strange Phenomenon. So long years of research taught them be open-minded and be skeptical, which is a delicate balance. Always give a fair hearing. Don't reject anything outright, and don't just jump in with both feet and enthusiasm without being careful to check. And they said because some of the craziest stories they have heard, they were able to absolutely prove they really happened. Did they have an explanation? Not always, but they could prove that they happened. So there was a magazine that used to be popular called Fate magazine, and they accessed some stories from this magazine, and in some cases they were able to contact the original experiencers. So this family got a call in the middle of the night from an old friend. And apparently, this was so good I didn't want to paraphrase it. Okay, so I'll tell you the story here. It's a little complicated, so I didn't bother to write it out. So Lee Epps and a guy called last name Owens once lived in the same neighborhood. But then Lee moved to another area, and as the years rolled by, they gradually drifted apart. After Lee's move, a casual dinner engagement, an evening out, or a telephone conversation was the most contact that he had. But Owens writes that at 10:30 p.m. on October 26, 1968, while I, Mr. Owens, was out, a phone call came from Lee. It was urgent. My wife answered and immediately recognized his voice, close friend, right? What little he said, or the way he said it, it greatly upset the wife. She tried to call him back a few minutes later, but she got no answer. So this is the message he left with her before he hung up. Sis, and he used to always call her Sis. He said, Sis, tell Don Owens, I'm feeling real bad. Never felt this way before. Tell him to get in touch with me the minute he comes in. It's important, Sis. So the message upset Don Owens, when he got home and heard it. It upset him as much as it upset his wife, Ethel. So Don Owens called his friend Lee's number and he got no answer. And he called repeatedly and he never got an answer. So the sequel to this urgent call was bound to shock and upset the Owenses even more than the message itself. That very evening, Mr. Owens said, I learned later that Lee lay in a coma in Mercy Hospital, less than 6 blocks from our house. He died at 10:30, the exact time that he called our home. My wife talked to him and readily recognized his voice. No doubt about it that Lee had made the call. So, hospital record of the exact time of death. The wife wrote down the time Lee called. Maybe a difference of minutes if the clocks were not synchronized. Nevertheless, at the moment of death, he called his good friend. So then they started investigating and they asked, well, did he come out of a coma at the last minute and call us and then die? But then they had a friend who was a doctor and he explained to them that wasn't possible. What was wrong with him? The coma that he was in, you don't just come out of that momentarily. And even if you did, you wouldn't have the digital dexterity to dial. And I put exclamation point because yes, we're talking about rotary dial phones. This is a while back. So then they asked, well, who called? They didn't dismiss that a call happened. So they've eliminated the possibility that the guy was in any shape to make the call himself. In 1976, they began collecting these sorts of stories. They don't have an answer. They started collecting these stories and they actually found hundreds of them and they gave them the name phantom phone calls. When they began their careers, they had dismissed these cases. Now, these are parapsychologists. They're paranormal investigators who are scientists. And they had dismissed these cases as being too unbelievable and the phone just too mundane. I mean, how ordinary. Why would an elevated spirit pick up the phone? I mean, come on, it's ridiculous, right? which that seemed very odd to them. But then they went on to study out-of-body experiences and ESP and poltergeists and then psychic contact with the dead. And their careers in that direction evolved. Upon investigation, they saw how common and how universally ignored the phenomenon of these phone calls was. So also a story from Fate magazine almost makes you want to get a subscription. This was submitted as being true by a Mrs. Viola Tolan of Indiana. Mrs. Tolan had been very friendly with her neighbor's caretaker, Davis Stone, as well as with his young daughter, Ruby. This bond of affection came to a tragic end when the little girl died at the age of 7. Sometime later, Stone himself was severely injured when he fell from a ladder on his employer's estate. So you get the impression that they're living next door to a kind of a fancy mansion, and they had a guy who took care of the place for the owner. So this Davis Stone was not living there. He wasn't a neighbor. He worked there every day, and he brought his daughter with him, and they got to be friends, and his little girl died. Then he fell from a ladder at the house next door and was severely injured. And in the words of this story, he was nearly crippled by the accident, which naturally limited his ability to work. If he so much as sat or fell asleep in the wrong position, the strain on his muscles would incapacitate him for weeks. Not willing to admit defeat, he kept up with his job despite the handicaps of the injuries. Not long after his fall, Davis's employers went on vacation, and Davis had complete responsibility for the estate. The job was really too much for one person, and I was continually on watch to see that he didn't hurt himself again. One evening just before dark, my phone rang and I answered it. I heard a voice I recognized but could not place. It was the tiny voice of a child. The conversation was brief. They told me, I wrote they who, this is a long time ago. People were a little bit more strict about pronouns, and she said it is the voice of one child. And I thought it was important to make that clear. One child. Told me that I could not telephone, but I just did, didn't I? Oh, I see. Okay. They is the voice, the little girl's voice says, they told me I couldn't telephone. Now, this is interesting because who's they? Who's she talking about? Quote from the phone. They told me I couldn't telephone, but I just did, didn't I? The peculiar voice explained. Mrs. Tolan was puzzled and said, I recognize your voice, but who are you? You know me. The little girl said, I'm Ruby. Mrs. Tolan was alarmed by the call, immediately realized that something must be wrong with Davis, the caretaker. After giving the caller a quick goodbye and receiving a polite thank you in return, she darted next door to make sure everything was okay. Nobody answered to her knock, so after finding a rear door had been left unlocked, she searched room after room of the house and found Davis Stone. He had fallen asleep in an awkward position that would have incapacitated him for weeks. Luckily, she was able to waken him up before any more damage was done to his spine or his legs. Who called, and who were they that told her, whoever she was, to call? Very interesting. So this is typical of these kind of calls. They sort of have a pattern. The voice does identify itself. It has a specific reason for calling, and often they talk about they, and who are they talking about? It's very similar to hundreds of cases. So why were they ignored, all these cases, not studied, barely even heard of? It's not something that people talk about in the mainstream, maybe behind closed doors. Because people who get calls are reluctant to report for fear of ridicule. That really is what boils down to. But psychic experiences are not rare. A majority of people won't admit to them, even though they aren't rare. They rarely confess to somebody like a parapsychologist, because that's like a scientist and a rational person. And, they say to themselves, experiencers, people will think I'm crazy. You hear it all the time. 100 or more years ago, these sorts of phenomena were really taboo in conventional conversation or written narrative. Getting more scientific and more public about it, giving them recognition, um, is happening more and more. And this is talking still about the late 70s. I would argue that it's really come out into the open. Um, they're looking at them in schools, universities, in laboratories, and research centers. And you can even now get a PhD in parapsychology, which really sounds like fun. It's a more acceptable area of inquiry. And it's also more acceptable to talk about your personal experiences. People were more reticent in the past to be very open about private things. People are still uncomfortable with the idea of these phone calls. Excuse me, they get lumped together with things like out-of-body experiences and UFOs as far as something that people were more reluctant in those days to talk about at the dinner table. The recipients of calls doubt their own experience. They question themselves. They never wanted their names published. The book tells of a psychoanalyst, a Dr. Lester Gelb, and his mother died in January of 1970 at the age of 90. First, before she died, she had lost her sight, become partially deaf, and quit eating on purpose. She lived with her daughter at the end of her life. Dr. Gelb would call her on the phone almost every day, knew her voice well because he lived and worked elsewhere and his sister took care of their mother. But he called her constantly, and he would ring her and she would pick up the phone, and she always said Lester, because that was his name. And one day, about 2 months after her death, the phone rang. I wonder who could it be? I remember feeling annoyed, the New York psychoanalyst told them. I picked up the wall phone in our kitchen, and after I said hello, the voice on the phone said, Lester? I was shocked and perplexed to hear the voice of my mother. Stunned, he repeatedly asked the caller to identify herself, but the voice, always speaking in the same tone of voice, only kept echoing the doctor's name. Finally, after what he described as a clacking sound, the phone went dead. He continued to talk, hoping to get a bit more conversation out of the mystery caller, but there was no response. After hanging up, I joined my waiting family. My wife asked me who called, and I answered, only that it was somebody asking for me, and had then hung up. I felt too disoriented and perplexed to provide further details until a week later. The voice didn't identify itself, which is a little off course for these kind of calls. Gelb had no doubt about it, though. It was his mother's voice. He heard it all the time. He was used to it. And he says, I had training in music, and I have a really good ear. I know my mother's voice. Yet still, he was a skeptic about phone calls from the dead. He still wasn't sure about this communication after death being possible. And he wanted to believe that it was a living person who had an identical voice to his mother's voice. He tried to rationalize. This is common self-doubt. Experiencers go through this quite a bit. And it's why they don't report things as often as they happen, and why they can often rationalize these things away. The authors felt that it was a real call, that one of his patients wouldn't know that that his patients might know that his mother lived afar, and they might know that he talked to his mother every day, but they wouldn't necessarily know that she always started every phone call with Lester. And that was kind of a particular bit of evidence. These experiencers are found to be reluctant to share until they find others who have the same calls. Yeah, they don't want to get laughed at, right? Often they feel that it's too personal or private. The content of the call or the relationship was just so sensitive that they didn't want to put it out there for public discussion. And the authors here say, are we talking about something that is almost sacred to them? Somebody told them it was a treasure in my memory. Sometimes callers from the dead give information that only they could know. As in Don Owen's case, the voice that called the sister Sis, which was a personal nickname nobody else ever used. Or a voice will use a distinctive phrase or expression particular to the dead person. For example, a famous Hollywood actress who wants to remain secret, as a child, received a collect call from a long-distance operator. Remember them? And interestingly enough, they weren't able to trace the call later. There was no record of the call with the operator or the telephone company, and no long-distance charge was ever made. But there were people who saw this phone call happen. So what the heck was that? Then they give her a pseudonym. I think I know who it is. I think maybe later they identify her in retrospect, or maybe I've read this somewhere else. I'll tell you who I think it is if they don't. It's been a while since I read the book and took notes on it. So, which is kind of why I'm stumbling over part of it. It's been quite a while since I prepared this book. And, you know, I'm so clever with my shorthand, and then I can't read it when I go back to it. So she says, when I was about 8 years old, I was living in Texas. My mother had a very dear friend whose daughter had gone away to college. The daughter came back home around the first of the year each year. The third year went while on her way back home, she was killed in a car crash. A couple of years later, we were over at the home of this friend a friend of my mother's, for Thanksgiving, which was one of the holidays for which the daughter always came home. So they're at this Thanksgiving gathering at the bereaved mother's house. The telephone rang. I was at the age when if the grown-ups were away in the living room and the kids were running around, I would answer the phone. I picked up the phone and heard the long-distance operator say, I have a collect call. She mentioned the name of my mother's friend, and she mentioned the name of the daughter. So the call was for the mother, and it was from the dead daughter. This threw me a little bit, even as a child, and I said, just a minute, and went and got my mother's friend. She came to the phone, and I stood watching her because I'd heard the name of the caller and thought that maybe somebody was playing a joke. The mother listened on the phone, turned absolutely white, and fainted. Later on, I heard what happened. There was a great hushing up about it, but I learned that she heard her daughter, who had been dead 2 or 3 years. Daughter spoke to her. She said the same thing she always did before she came home. This was a little personal joke between the daughter and the mother. The daughter's voice said, Mommy, it's me. I need $20 to get home. The mother always sent her $20 for good luck. She said she recognized her voice. They called the phone company, but there was no record of any call. Getting goosebumps yet? The $20 request was a long-standing family joke. It was significant. The mother recognized the voice and especially the phrase, almost as though the voice repeated that phrase to reassure the mother this was the real thing. The common use of a private joke, and this often happens in these calls. They're often very short, and it's like they're cut short because they require so much energy on the part of the caller. The call was a special day. That often happens, with meaning to the family because the daughter always came home for that day. And weirdly, it was placed by an operator. I mean, the little girl who became a star, the little girl talked to the operator. The operator asked for the mother. But there was no charge, no record of the call, no bill for the call. Could it have been a hoax, or did a real entity talk to a real operator? When the authors first started studying this, they only knew of a few cases, but that changed. They got lots of stories from friends, lots of stories from other parapsychologists who had collected the stories and put them in a box, kind of ignored them. This was truly unexplored ground. One question was, could the receiver be rising its own psychic abilities using okay, so the phone rings and you pick it up. Is it you, the answerer, the receiver, who has the psychic ability and is creating the phenomenon? I think that's called psi. So they concluded, or they created categories of three different categories. The first being apparent calls from the dead. This is what we were talking about. It is an apparent call from the dead. Sometimes the receiver will not know that the caller is already dead, as in the case of the guy in the hospital. The second is what they call intention calls. There's an urgent message from a live person or from an unknown person, but they later find out that the person didn't call at all, but the message was really important. The person ostensibly who did call, the so-called caller, who really didn't call in real life, had a strong intention to call, didn't make the call, but the call happened in their voice. And then there are what they call answer cases, where a receiver actually makes the call, has the conversation, and later discovers that the other person was dead. So it's a little bit of a reversal. The live person calls a friend, has a conversation with the friend, finds out later that friend had died, or finds out later that that friend wasn't home, like was out of town. And keep in mind, this is before cell phones and all the weird technology that connects us in a tangled web. This was straightforward stuff, the technology of the time. Like let's say I called Mary, talked to Mary, and a week later I mentioned the call, and Mary looks at me like, what? I was in Paris. What do you mean you called me at my house down the street? I was in Paris. That kind of thing. So they realized these calls could be more mysterious than they thought. There's kind of more complicated stuff to them. And I tried really hard to make sense of the explanations that they had. Not that the explanations were nonsensical, but that the explanations were sometimes technical and a little bit hard for me to understand. Let's put it that way. But we're going to get the professor on here, and he can explain it much better than I can, I'm quite sure. So most of the calls were from the first type, which is, let me make sure I get the title right, apparent calls from the dead. Over the past 100 years, there have been reports about voices of the dead speaking over record player amplifiers, appearing on magnetic tape, remember those tape cassettes, communicating over telegraph keys, or coming through a host of other types of electronic equipment. To understand these mysterious phone calls from the dead, then, we must delve into these related enigma as well. Let's begin at the beginning. So now we're on chapter 3, Phone Calls from the Dead, a survey of cases. I told you this was a fun book. Many of these cases have been anecdotal and not well authenticated. So I think he's saying grain of salt. Sometimes the caller sounds well prepared with a goal or a message. Those are those intention calls. Other times the caller sounds very vague and confused or lost even. And some seem surprised that the contact was successful, like, oh, I got through. The researchers divided the calls that they studied into two kinds of calls. The first was a brief call, some interrupted, but the interaction is brief and ended very quickly, which are simple calls. And the second kind are lengthy conversations with the person who answered the call, actually having a conversation with the caller. And these are called prolonged calls. They're less common. Type 2, the longer calls, are talked about in a book called The Power of the Mind by S. Smith. So these are some examples. Two witnesses to this event provided notarized statements. The McConnell family were friends with an author by the name of Enid. They lost touch as she was shuffled between nursing homes. She was aging and moved around. It was very sad. They lost touch with her. They always had spent Christmas with each other, and they had always given her a bottle of blackberry wine every Christmas. After losing touch for months, they got a call in May. It was a Sunday. Enid sounded better, fine. She didn't sound sick. They talked for 30 minutes. And during the conversation, Mrs. McConnell told Enid, now that I found you, next week is your birthday, and I'll bring you a bottle of wine. And Enid said to her, oh, I don't need it now. Enid then went on to tell Mrs. McConnell, now Enid is the older author who's in a nursing home. The McConnells are friends. They couldn't find her because she'd been moved around so much. Happy to reconnect. Next week's your birthday. Going to bring you a present, a traditional bottle of wine. Enid says, I don't need it, but I've never had such good care. And she named this hospital. And she regretted that they had never finished working on the book, Enid and Mrs. McConnell, that they had been working together on like they planned. So the conversation ended. And after the call, her husband said, that sounds like Enid from 20 years ago. She sounds great. So Enid had told them that she didn't have the phone by her bed. And then she said something really odd, because she had not been able to she wasn't mobile, but she didn't have the phone by her bed. They didn't think too much of it. They thought somebody gave her the phone. But then she said that she'd been getting around fine, and I've never been happier, before she hung up. The conversation was about personal things. They were reminiscing quite a bit. This voice knew all about their personal friendship history. So at the end of the week, Enid's birthday's coming up. Mrs. McConnell calls the hospital to talk to Enid for her birthday. And the hospital tells them that Enid died Sunday morning, several hours before the phone call. She said, we talked with her at 5 o'clock in the evening, and we talked for half an hour, more than half an hour, but she died 10:30 that morning before our conversation. This is not a unique story, apparently. Here's another story recorded by Dr. Schwartz, a longtime psychiatrist who studies parapsychology. And the story begins with Mrs. A. A lot of initials going on around here. Mrs. A had a dream of a childhood friend, Lana, sinking into a pool of blood. She woke up and she thought it was symbolic of some bad event that happened to Lana, like a precognitive kind of dream. Her husband advised her, call Lana. Lana answered, and she had been sick. She'd been in the hospital. She said she was out now, but would be returning the next day to the hospital. Mrs. A said that she'd visit her. I'll visit you while you're in the hospital. And Lana said, no, don't. So for days, Lana didn't answer her phone. And Mrs. A's calls just were ignored. So she finally called Lana's next door neighbor and was told, oh, you didn't know. Lana died 6 months ago. So it's like a phone call to the dead, right? She called her to see if she was okay. She'd been dead for 6 months, but she talked to her. Here's another case. This is Mrs. S. Her favorite aunt was killed. 18 months previous to the story, her aunt was killed in a car wreck. 6 months after her death, Mrs. S got a call. She talked for more than half an hour, and she said, after we hung up, I thought it was horrible. This was Aunt Lorraine. But Aunt Lorraine had died. Now and she got the chills, and she redialed and got no answer. So this is weird, and they saw this more often than you would think. Person gets a phone call from a loved one who they are fully aware is dead, but they sort of carry on a conversation and don't react till after the fact. He says this weird kind of selective amnesia that she was able to carry on the conversation, even though she knew her aunt was dead. She talked to her like she was alive. And she didn't, in the moment of the conversation, she didn't pause and say, hey, you're dead. Or think to herself, wait a minute, she's dead. It's, oh, hi, it's Aunt Lorraine. How you doing? Blah, blah, blah. Make the phone call, hang up, and go, oh, she's been dead for months. So is this a psychological amnesia, a psychic amnesia? What's going on here? The psychological explanation would be that it was a trauma reaction. Some people can function through a big shock, like you pick it up, it's your dead aunt, and you're shocked, but you still function and hang up, and then you react. This is termed, that kind of reaction is termed unaffectable or stoic. Some people have violent reactions to anxiety, and then they may repress the moment of trauma. So they're so freaked out that they don't even recognize that they've been freaked out. So an example that he gives is there's a car wreck, and the person who's in the car wreck forgets the moment of the crash. It's a shock reaction to a life-threatening situation. Some reactions like that become what's called a fugue state. It's such a shock that the person operates on automatic pilot and later remembers nothing about that time period, that fugue state. It's a rare type of temporary amnesia. Now, you may not remember what happened during the state, but you do return to the memory of who you really are. That's why they call it temporary. It's characterized by a sudden, unaffected, unexpected wandering or travel from home with complete amnesia for one's own identity and past, and it can resolve quickly or it can last months. Now, I bet many of you are thinking the same thing here. This is very much what happened to Agatha Christie, the writer. She had an 11-day fugue state. Her mother died unexpectedly, and immediately after her mother died and she found out about it, she walked into the house, and on the table there was a letter from her husband confessing to infidelity, and he was leaving her. And this combined trauma created this shocking moment, and she went into a fugue state. In this state, she no longer knew she was Agatha Christie. She gave herself the name of her husband's mistress. And while she was gone, that's who she thought she was by name. The explanation here is the mind forces painful memories out of the consciousness. And then fugue states usually are temporary, and you come out of them, and she came home. People said, where were you? And she really didn't have an explanation because she had amnesia for that fugue state. So then that's one explanation. Another would be a psychic explanation for these calls. Is there some sort of paranormal cause? Did some entity or energy cause her to forget her aunt was dead so she could speak with her aunt? The authors say this is bizarre, but possible, I guess. They say this shows that it's important to study the people who receive these calls as much as it is to investigate the alleged dead caller. At first, they thought that these types of long calls, they seemed contrived and kind of unbelievable. They'd hear these stories and they'd go, oh, right. But they encountered so many of them that were so similar to each other that they couldn't just dismiss them. In most of them, although not the one we just told, the recipient believes that they were talking to a living person until after the fact. They have a long, long conversation, later find out this person's been dead a while. In the particular case we just talked about, she knew her aunt was dead, and yet she had a conversation with her. Can these calls that are long occur as long as the witness doesn't know it's psychic. So is that why the calls from her aunt gave her amnesia? However, most of the calls, many more, are very brief. So then we talk about the Reverend Harlow, who wrote A Life After Death. He was a religion professor at Smith College, and he wrote about 2 cases. One of his first books by a Christian minister, this was one of the first books by a Christian minister to contribute to parapsychological studies of life after death. A little bit shaky surface for him to wander into. One of his cases in the book was a Mrs. S. who was friends of an old man. The old man was the son of Admiral Farragut of the Civil War. So this old man died. And the next day, a house guest of hers answered the phone. So the house guest, well, I picture them wandering around in their robe and the phone calls, and being polite, they picked up the phone. And the phone call asked for Farragut, and went on to claim that Farragut had called this caller the day before. They hadn't talked in 4 years. And since it was Farragut, he was sure it was Farragut. And the line to Farragut quickly went dead. And that was the end of that conversation. But the call was made 3 hours after Farragut had died. So the woman got a call from her husband at work. This is a different example. Got a call from her husband at work who said goodbye. And she did not know that he had died in his office an hour earlier. There's a neuropsychiatrist called Dr. Moss, and he had a case. She had a case. A student of hers had a son who died climbing mountains in India. The mother tried to call to confirm that he had actually died. She wasn't sure. And she couldn't get through to anyone who could help her. And this is a long time ago. It was a little harder to make connections all the way into India. That night, her phone rang, and her son said, "Hello, Mother." She was relieved and said, "Well, my God, how are you?" He said, "Hello" again, and then the phone went dead. And she found out later that he had already been dead when that call was made. This woman's friend named Elsie died, and a few weeks later, she got a call, and she heard this faint voice saying, "Elsie, Elsie," and it faded away and the line died. As with many phantom calls, they can hear people, but they don't get a reply from them. The receiver can hear the voice, but won't get an answer when they try to talk. It's especially true if the death is very recent. Longer calls come from people who've been dead for a longer time. So you get the sense of maybe they were building up the calling muscle or something over time. The McConnell case is a rare exception. Often in these short conversations, the caller seems very confused, like the dead person seems confused. And they're surprised, taken aback, or they don't realize that they've actually been successful making contact with the living. For example, a case reported by a Dr. Medved, that he was really anxious for an explanation about this. His mother died in 1974. She had wished to be buried in Idaho. Dr. Medved went by car from Los Angeles to Idaho to his mother's funeral and then returned to Los Angeles. Back in Los Angeles, the next day he got a phone call. He thought it might be a sister, but the voice dismayed him. He was shocked. The voice said, "Johnny, Johnny," twice. He asked, "Who is this?" And the voice said, "Is that you, Johnny dear?" And he thought, okay, this has got to be some kind of malicious joke. And he said, "What's the matter? Who is this?" And the voice said, "It's your mother." And then the voice faded away. He kept talking, but the voice was gone. The phone never went dead. He finally had to hang up. And it was his mother's voice, and he recognized his mother's voice, and that's why he was so aggressively questioning, because come on, this is not possible. He had a house guest at the time. Everybody seems to have house guests in these calls. He had a house guest who confirmed, I saw this conversation, and Dr. Medved was shaken. And he said, I don't know what's going on, but I just talked to my mother. Sometimes the caller, the voice from the dead, is able to get a message across. In the case of an investigation of a haunting, an investigator told of a room renter, somebody renting a room, who got a phone call. He was 18, he was boarding with a family, rented a room. So the story is, I'm not sure if it's a grandmother. Yes, I think it must be grandmother. His grandmother had died. They had been very close. She'd been getting deaf. She often called this 18-year-old, and she called him for help with things when he was living at home. Now he's away at school. He was living at home. He was her favorite. He'd run over and help his grandmother. She often tracked him down, even when he was at friends' houses, and asked him to help. When he answered her call, she always said the same thing. And like his friends would get a call at their house. He'd be visiting. He'd be over at Bob's house. Bob's phone would ring. Bob would pick up the phone, and the grandmother would say, is Carl there? Carl was the grandson who was 18. Tell Carl to come home now. So 2 days after her death, he was at a friend's house, and his mother, the friend's mother, answered the phone. And Carl's grandmother asked to speak to Carl. The voice said, tell him to come home now. Carl got pale when he heard this from his friend's mother and said, but she's dead. So the friend's mother thought, okay, you guys, you got me. You're hilarious. She just thought these 18-year-olds were teasing her. But he went on to phone, and he went to the phone. There was nobody there. The line was still open. He took the phone from his friend's mother, shook. She's like, okay, you're hilarious. Takes the phone. There's nobody there. So the author spoke with Carl later, and they spoke with his friend. Carl said, because she was deaf, she would repeat her one line, because she really couldn't hear well enough to carry on a conversation on the phone. So she would say, is Carl there? Tell him to come home right now. And it happened all the time. This was like her stock phone message. The call after her death was identical to the calls that she made all the time. Nobody at his friend's house knew that his grandmother had died. And it's because he was new to the area. He was now renting a room. He was at school. He had a whole new circle of friends. People around him didn't really know him at all. They were like brand new friends. Invited him home because, he's a new student. And while he was at school, his sister had been taking care of the grandmother. So the plot thickens here. Okay, so this new friend, Peter, says, we were talking. This is the testimonial from the friend who was there. We were talking or playing or something, and I heard my mother not arguing. I don't recall the words, but she sounded miffed. And boys weren't paying really much attention, but the mother yelled down to Carl and said, there's an old woman on the phone. She says she's your grandmother and she needs you. She just keeps saying it over and over. And Peter says, in all my life, I've never seen anybody turn as white as Carl did. He was like marble white, and he took my stairs in 3 bounds. And then Carl says, well, when I grabbed the phone, there was no one on the line. He was very disappointed. Great story. That night at home, Carl went back to his room, and he got several calls, and there was nobody on the line. there's this weird synchronicity when the authors first called Dr. S to ask about any phone calls. Dr. S had just decided to get in touch with him to tell about the calls. So there's all these weird coincidences. Other weirdnesses. I can't pronounce the name, Schwartz has two cases. First, there was a Walter Uphoff and Marie D'Alessio. And then there was Carl Uphoff, not related, and Mrs. Sam D'Alessio, a lot of similar names, right? Uphoff was a distant cousin to the other Uphoff. They were vaguely related. They didn't know each other. And the two D'Alessios were unrelated. So you've got two separate phone calls from the dead. Uphoff and D'Alessio, Uphoff and D'Alessio. The Uphoffs are distantly related and really didn't know each other, like fifth cousins or something. D'Alessios were not related. Just weird synchronicities in a lot of these things. Maybe statistically it would have happened anyway. Another case, a 45-year-old man says to his wife, "Have I told you lately how much I love you?" He goes camping and drops dead. Later, back at home, the phone rang, and a faint voice began reciting a Browning poem. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." That poem, and it faded away. And it was faintly his voice. She didn't know he'd dropped dead. So there's a type 3 case. A third party gets a call with an urgent message for somebody else, not realizing that this caller with the urgent message for somebody else is calling him from the dead. Dr. S had a secretary, and she went for elective surgery while he was on vacation. She took the opportunity to have this surgery. Before he left, he had asked her, "Please remind me to call about insurance when I get back." She died in surgery. So he remembered, oh, I have to call the insurance company. And he did it the morning before her funeral. So shocked, his secretary has died. He had a vacation. She died. He's shocked. But he did remember, I have to make that call. So he calls. And while he's on the phone, the insurance guy on the other line, while he's on the phone with the insurance man says, "Hang on a second, my other line is ringing." And he comes back to the doctor and he says, "Oh, it's your secretary. She's calling to tell me," the insurance guy, "about the same thing that you're on the phone for." The doctor says, yeah, but she died last week. And the insurance guy says, I told her you were on the other line. And she said, "In that case, I'll consider the message delivered." So Dr. S calls the temporary secretary, and she didn't make the insurance call. She knew nothing about it. The student worker in the office had no idea what anybody was talking about. And the insurance guy said, "Yeah, the phone seemed a little weird. I never heard anybody hang up," from the secretary. So most calls just seem to want contact with the living, usually. And sometimes they're social calls, and sometimes there are emergencies, but not very often. It's almost so, like sometimes they want to just accomplish something. It's like they're not calling to warn you that your house is on fire or that don't get in the car tomorrow. More likely, they're just calling to connect. And sometimes they really do have a goal. They want to complete work that's not finished. And these sorts of calls give clues to the nature of the purpose and source of the calls. So the big question now is this really the dead calling, or is there some kind of force at play here that we don't understand? And with that, I'm going to end this video. It's perfect time to end before the next chapter. And we'll start video number 2 with chapter 4. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's not too confusing because there's a lot of he said, she said, and then I can't read my handwriting. But I hope getting enough of a gist of these very odd occurrences. And maybe we'll ask the professor about knowing when somebody's going to call. That's a good one. I love that one. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. I will be back. Slánga foil, slánja.